Okay, so I maybe one of the few speakers that actually does not have an affiliation, hasn't been connected to PSE. However, there's no doubt that the transfer of human capital that PSE has done to MIT is enormous, and so I'm very grateful for all that. So this is a joint work with Alp Simsek, and the starting point of this is a picture that Emmanuel, is Emmanuel around here? That Emmanuel and I sort of use frequently. And what you see in the shaded area is the interest rate, the safe interest rate in the US. And we have written many papers about sort of this declining path of I was talking about you, a picture that we like. This is an extended version of that. But anyway, the shaded area is the path of interest rates in the US, safe interest rates. And the very clear pattern is a declining pattern. We talked many years ago about the role of China, the role of the Asian crisis in creating a sort of excess saving and a contraction in the supply of assets in the world, and how that was driving interest rate down. Now that process got interrupted a little bit before the crisis, because the private sector in the US, especially the financial sector, developed a technology to create pseudo safe assets, out of subprime mortgages, repackaging and producing tranches of safe assets. Well, that industry collapsed during the subprime crisis, and we went back to the old trend, and eventually, we hit sort of what most people perceive as being a lower bound. Right? And when I work today in the model I present today, I'm going to have a strict lower bound, but there are many reasons in practice why it's difficult to move interest rate very low, and it's quite clear that here, despite being in the middle of a crisis, it was difficult to adjust this interest rate further down. Now, something that we did not pay much attention to early on, because it looked like the first order things you could capture with sort of imbalances of savings and investment, something that we didn't pay very much attention to was the gray area, and the gray area is the equity risk premium. Okay, and that's an average of over many equity risk premium that people have estimated. This is from a work from Duarte and Rosa, but it's a summary. So it's a very good and robust summary of sort of different estimates of the equity risk premium. And what happened to this is that initially sort of DNY, then it came down. So the cost of capital really for the private sector came down together with the safe interest rates. But at some point, it began to not follow this. And certainly after the subprime crisis, it certainly did not follow the sharp decline in the safe rate. So the equity risk premium actually increased over this period. So there was a clear sense of, if you look at the world today, and you look at the world 20 years ago, 30 years ago, there is a certain degree of risk intolerance that wasn't present then. And it's interesting that at the same time, you see sort of lots of comments about secular stagnation, so very unrobust growth, very weak growth going on in the real economy. Now, you think for a minute, we as macroeconomists don't think very much about that, but if you think for a minute, there ought to be a connection between this risk intolerance and what is happening on the real side of the economy. When a productive capacity, and certainly the expansion of the productive capacity growth, requires agents not only to observe the goods, output, but also the risks. New productive capacity generates new risks. We in macro focus mostly on the former. We worry about whether we have enough demand really to absorb all this output, but we also need to have the risk tolerance to absorb the risks that are being generated by this productive capacity. Now, there's a field, finance, especially asset pricing within finance, that doesn't really worry about the output side, the output gap. It worries exclusively about how the economy absorbs the risk, and not even the economy, how to price the assets in a way that, that people will be willing to absorb the risk generated by the productive capacity at any point in time. In macro, we do look at the connection between asset prices and aggregate demand, things like that, but risk is not very central to our analysis. It's there, it's in the background, sometimes it gets against a more prominent role, but we focus mostly on the output gap, on the insufficiency of demand to absorb the output, not the risk generated by that capacity. Now, there have been sort of recent attempts at integrating these two gaps that could be there, the risk gap and the output gap. We build on that work. We build on a lot of works. We do a lot of things in this paper, but we will build particularly on two pillars. The first one is more methodological build. That is Brunemeyer and Sannikov have sort of summarized the financial frictions literature, if you will, in a sort of very macro finance world. So they have essentially brought into a macro sort of a set of tools that are very much used in finance, and that they have the virtue of really using all the moments of the distributions. Risk is a very central aspect of the analysis itself. That's what finance is about. Okay? And the other pillar is more substantive. It's something that Emmanuel and I have done, and when we do it in the open economy, we have brought along Pierre Olivier, is about the connection between the safe asset shortage, the lack of safe assets, which is what we argue drove that interest rate down that I showed you in the first picture, and that eventually, when it can get resolved, it can leak into aggregate demand problems. Okay, and the model I present today has that feature. It's more of a business cycle type model rather than about an episode, but it exactly has that kind of mechanism. It's a problem in the risk markets that finds its way into the goods markets and generates an output gap in that market. Okay, so the contribution of this paper is part of this literature of trying to integrate sort of the risk and output gaps, if you will, and hence the title Risk-centric model of aggregate demand and so on. So the contribution of this paper is first to provide a framework to study sort of the interplay of risk, asset prices, and aggregate demand, and so to revisit sort of macro issues from the point of view of this finance perspective. In the policy side, we look at macroprudential policy and monetary policy. Risk markets will do things to the real side, and therefore there will be a role for regulating financial markets, even if you only worry about the goods market. Okay, and we look at sort of monetary in quotes, interest rate policy, if you will. There's no money in this model. Everything is real. But sort of we know the tricks how to go from one to the other. And I think something I like of this perspective is the narrative. So the contribution is also the narrative. It's a little bit of flipping the standard macro hierarchy, where we sort of look at mostly things that happens in the goods market, and then we talk about the rest. I want to display certain things that happen in macro that are very prominent that can be explained from the risk market's point of view. So it's going to be a risk-centric explanation of conventional macro issues, if you will. Okay? So I'm going to do this paper twice, essentially. First, I want to explain the paper in words, and hopefully you keep your M at 0.5 here, and then you can disconnect it to 0 later on. But this part should be easier. The variance is, he didn't talk about the cost of analyzing certain news and so on. I think here the cost is low, later it's a little higher. But what is the framework? And then I want to tell you what are the results, again, in words. The framework is essentially the aggregate supply side of the model. Is very simple. It's a stochastic endogenous growth model. So it's going to be an economy of the future. There will be no workers, just robots here. No, and there will be shocks that will affect that. And there will be on the background, but I will not model that explicitly, some sort of sticky prices. Okay. Or some rationing at some times. And that's the reason why aggregate demand may matter. Aggregate demand may matter because on the background there is some sort of sticky prices, and therefore the level of aggregate demand may be an additional constraint for producers in this economy, okay? Which is a standard mechanism we have to explain sort of Keynesian phenomena. So there's nothing new there, but aggregate demand will matter due to a very specific constraint, which will be a lower bound on the interest rate, some friction on the adjustment of interest rates, and the interesting things will happen there. There will be two shocks. One will be to productivity. It will be a diffusion. There will be ongoing productivity shocks, sort of very standard stuff. But occasionally, and this is going to be important here, there will be some equity risk premium type shocks, which will be some Poisson shocks. Okay, so occasionally the markets are going to get more worried, or consumers are going to get more worried about risk in the economy, and that could be real risk or perceived risk. We're going to model it just because it's simpler as actual risk, so that diffusion will have a higher volatility at some point. But really, I would prefer a model in which it is really the perception of risk more than the actual risk, but that introduces some hedging components and so on that are a nuisance, so we haven't done it for now. But I don't expect the first order conclusions to change if we do that. So equity risk premium shocks, okay? We're also going to have, at some point, most of what I'll do here today, I think that we will not have heterogeneous belief, but at some point we will introduce heterogeneous beliefs about this how lasting are these risk shocks. That's going to play many important roles in the framework. One of them is that it will introduce speculation. Now people are going to have different views about, how terrible are the current conditions in the economy, and that's going to lead to speculation. And speculation actually in this economy is going to be destabilizing, as you will see, again, through the goods markets. We're going to look at policies. The other thing we do in the paper is we look at interest rate policy, which is very simple here, forward guidance type policies, and macroprudential policies. So that's what we do, and that's what we find. That's the model. What do we find? Well, on the positive side, the cyclical aspect of the economy. So the first thing is a benchmark. In this economy, there is no interest rate friction. So that's the only friction that will matter in our economy, in most of the talk. At the end, I may introduce something else, but if we get there. But for most of the talk, the only interest rate would be some friction in the interest rate adjustment. Without it, really nothing happens. Without it, productivity shocks don't move anything. The only thing that they move is growth. So growth is moving around, but supply and demand are moving in tandem, and nothing happens. Nothing needs to adjust. Equity risk premium shocks, nothing will happen on the output side, but the interest rate will have to adjust. Okay? And that's important. I mean, that's essentially the essence of the message of this. The little contribution of this paper is that the interest rate has the potential to give the market, if people don't want to absorb risk in the economy, then you need to make risk more. If you don't want to change the size of the economy, then you need to make the risk more attractive to people. How do you make risk more attractive to people? Well, you give them a better Sharpe out of doing that. How do you do that? Well, you lower the risk-free rate, which is alternative to the risk investment. Okay? And that sort of allows people to absorb the risk that the current productive structure is generating. Okay? So that's what happens. If you can adjust the rate, you can always do it through that mechanism. Now, if you can't adjust the rate because there is a lower bound, some constraint, or because you sacrifice your financial system, or because you sacrifice your seniors, whatever the constraint is, that sort of limits that further adjustment, then you lose the ability to give people the right Sharpe for the risk that the economy is generating. Okay? And once you lose that, you need to give them the return some other way. The financial markets are faster than the goods markets in adjusting. So the financial markets say, well, we don't like the risk, we're getting out of it. What happens then? Well, getting out of it, the natural way of, what happens then is that the price of assets start declining. If the price of assets start declining, if nothing else changes, that's good news for the risk markets in the sense that, the Sharpe ratio rises, because if there's some sort of mean reversion, then lower prices today means higher expected return, higher capital gains. And that's a way you should restore balance in the financial market. Now, the problem of that is that that's not as generous as the previous adjustment, because that drag down in asset prices will also drag down aggregate demand. So that's the moment in which a problem in the financial market starts leaking into the goods market, because wealth declines. And even though Q theory is not working very well, as Thomas showed us yesterday, but there is a correlation between investment, consumption, and asset prices. So that comes down. Now, the problem is that when aggregate demand comes down in the goods market, that also depresses profits in corporations and so on, which further depresses asset prices and so on and so forth. So in fact, this economy is incredibly unstable. If we don't add anything else, it implodes. okay? Because there's a very strong feedback between aggregate demand and asset prices that brings you down. What stops it? You need some optimism. Somebody must think that, well, this stuff is going to end at some point. And therefore, these declining prices, asset prices, is a good opportunity. Aggregate demand plummets. But in the asset market, at some point, there is a bottom. When somebody says, well, regardless of aggregate demand being very low today, at some point in the future, this thing will be better, and I'm going to get a big capital gain if I get into this stuff here. You need that. So optimism in this economy is very, very important in limiting that fall in aggregate demand. And so the degree of optimism in the economy is crucial. Now, when you have heterogeneous beliefs, then the share of wealth owned by the optimists in an economy becomes very important as well, for exactly the same reason. You need those guys to support the system when the system is in a difficult time. No? And there were an additional problem. Well, so you need these guys to be wealthy at the right time. When you need them to support aggregate demand, you need them to support asset prices, and asset prices will support aggregate demand. Okay? But the problem is that these optimists are also going to tend to speculate. They think that things are better than they are or not, and so if things don't get better, they're going to sort of, their wealth is going to deplete. Or the opposite, when they're in the good times, they think they're going to last forever, they tend to sort of speculate, sell put options. No? And all those things are very destabilizing. The economy becomes very extrapolative. The booms become very, very pronounced booms. The recessions become very pronounced recessions because they're reinforced by this behavior.
Yeah, I don't understand this logic, the cycle. Why the aggregate demand goes down and then prices go down and then aggregate demand? Isn't there just an equilibrium mechanism? There's a level of aggregate.
Yeah. But if you think,
why unstable? You seem to make this into a dynamic mechanism, which I don't see happening.
That's a very good point. There is an equilibrium. Sometimes there isn't. Okay, and so I need something that's what I was trying to explain. And the reason there isn't is because I can't find a price that solves it because it drags down aggregate demand. Okay, so there is no dynamics. You're right. I was opening up sort of the box of the equilibrium, but that's a good question. Okay, and now furthermore, it turns out that just anticipation that there's speculation going on, and then therefore we can go into why is the speculation is bad is because then we can get into a situation where only pessimists are left with some wealth, and that's really makes that mechanism sort of very explosive. Just anticipation of this depresses aggregate demand, and so on. So that's what happens on the positive side in the economy. What happens on the policy side? Well, the first thing is that interest rate policy is highly effective while it lasts, for the reasons I just explained. It's that's a very efficient, cheap way of giving the market sort of the right sharp so they absorb all the risk that the economy needs to absorb. Now, forward guidance is also highly effective in this economy. So even when you cannot change the interest rate today, if you can still tell people that, once things go back to the good state, then interest rates are going to remain lower than they would have been, that has an effect. In fact, it's too powerful. And I think here I'm going to pause. I think here is where there are several parts where the kind of things that Xavier was talking about are important for macro. I think for some things even more important than his things, but we'll talk about that later. But one thing that matters here is that forward guidance here is incredibly powerful. And you would imagine, that's what we thought could start, that it would depend on the degree of optimism. So, okay, if you're going to promise people something that happens in the good state, and that's supposed to lift the economy now, but the economy is very pessimistic, that shouldn't really be very effective. It turns out that in the basic model, it doesn't matter. It's equally effective regardless of whether the economy is optimistic and pessimistic. And that's a point in which you relax a little bit the rationality assumption, that's not true anymore. And it really, you recover the common sense result. So to me, I think all the things you're talking about make a lot of sense. The way we have handled it in the past is the smell test. Rationality is just one of the simplifications we do to models. We don't believe it. Nobody believes it. Well, there may be a few sort of, ayatollahs out there, but nobody really believes it. But it's a convenient tool to use. But you have to pass the smell test. Here, this didn't pass the smell test to us, and therefore I said, okay, there's a very strong backward induction, the most overrated principle in economics. But there is a lot of backward induction here in one case. In the other one, there is little when the economy is optimistic, there isn't much backward induction in the argument that supports the economy. When the economy is pessimistic, there is a lot of backward induction supporting it. Well, that's a case where you have to wonder a little bit about your rationality assumption. Indeed, that's what happened. So it's very unrobust to small departures from rationality. Now, a macroprudential policy here makes everyone better off. And macroprudential policy will take the form of essentially behave the optimist during booms a little bit less optimistic. And that's, in terms of implementation, is a bunch of constraints on the portfolios they can take and so on. You have to be careful because there's lots of proxy hedgings they can do and things like that. But if you make them behave a little bit less optimistic, then everyone is better off. And they're all sort of, you have to be careful with welfare analysis with heterogeneous beliefs, but we do it under sort of it's robust across all preference and their own beliefs and blah, blah, blah. And because the dominant effect is an aggregate demand externality. So there is an aggregate demand externality here. You need these guys to be wealthy at the time in which aggregate demand is very depressed. That's first order that dominates everything else. And so there's a reason to do it. However, there's a reason also this is not a reason for regulation per se. It's a reason for macroprudential regulation in the sense that you want to do that in the boom but not in the recession. Why is that? Because prudential regulation is always depresses aggregate demand because you're telling optimists be less optimist. That's depresses the economy. In the boom, you can offset that with the interest rate cut. In the recession, deep recession, where you are against the zero lower bound, you can't offset the aggregate demand effect. So you would be taking aggregate demand at the worst time. Okay? I was in Australia sort of a month ago and so on, and they, every time you go to Australia, they have a problem with the housing market, there is a boom in real estate market, and blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, they didn't feel that the goods market was doing that well, and so, but the conclusion was at the end, the whole panel was, well, should we hike interest rates? Because to prevent sort of the boom in the financial market. And I said, no, I think what you should do is regulate more your banks, your developers and so on, and cut interest rate. There was a lot of noise in the room. But that's the logic that appears from this kind of model. Okay? So that's what we do. Again, as I said, now you can disconnect to m equals 0. I asked you for m equal 1/2 in this part. Now you can disconnect to m equals 0 if you want. So that's what we'll do. And now I'll go over the model. So environment and first order conditions, standard way we describe models, equilibrium and common belief. I'm going to focus mostly on the common beliefs part, and then I'm going to go quickly, I think, over the more complicated and important extension, I think, which is the belief disagreement section. But I will talk about macroprudential policy, forward guidance, and I may introduce at some point in complete markets. Because something else that is endogenous here is, there is an exogenous volatility. The equity risk premium may rise for exogenous reason, but there is also endogenous volatility. That's present in the basic model I present with complete markets, but it's very apparent in the incomplete markets case. And so I may get back into that and some final remarks. So let me tell you about sort of the supply side, and then consumer investors. And the key thing there is going to be really this consumer investor, and there's one first order condition that will matter a lot, but I have to get there. So potential output growth. Potential, I put the word potential, I highlighted, because this is going to be a Keynesian model, so at some point output will be below potential output. But potential output is going to be sort of an endogenous growth model, a la Brunner, Meyer, Sannikov, with jumps. So there is some index S there which denotes the state. The state is the equity risk premium state, or volatility state, if you will. But within each volatility state, there is a diffusion there, and the first term comes from. Oops. The first. What did I do? The first term there is just investment. Okay. So this grows. Everything is going to happen here. I could have the shock here or there. I'm going to put everything like they do in the effective capital. So it's going to be effective capital that is moving around. Productivity is going to be constant here, A. I could put productivity in A as well, and everything would be the same. But at the end, all that matters is this. So potential output has its diffusion characteristic. This is the investment component. No, and there's a Q-Tobin type model here, sort of a convex adjustment cost function here as a function of the investment rate minus depreciation, and then there is some shock there, which could be is the efficiency of that capital, the productivity of that capital. Okay, and I said there is some convex adjustment cost, so we want Q theory because we want to have asset prices, and that's the way we're going to get asset prices in here. And we're going to make it very simple, so the investment rate as a function of Q is effectively standard linear on Q. Now, this is the function that, one of the functions that Thomas just talked about, and he said, well, it's very clear that after the crisis, this function has shifted down. I mean, the psi has gone down. And I want to talk a little bit about that later when we get there to connect with things. But that's pretty standard. Well, in equilibrium, I'm not going to talk very much about this, but there will be terms like this, so let me mention it, even though there will be zero for most of my talk. But in equilibrium, what will happen here is that price will follow some diffusion, but it turns out that in what I will discuss here, which first has complete markets, this term drops out. And second, in the case in which I have a homogeneous belief, the representative agent, this term drops out. So all that I will not be able to do, I think, today is bring this guy back, but not that one. Okay? But you'll see expressions like that, they're zeros, and I'll remind you they're zeros. Maybe I should have cleansed them. But anyways, that's what happens within each volatility state. But occasionally you'll get jumps, spikes in volatility and so on, and then this Q will jump. May jump. I mean, it's not jumping, it was in fact in the first best case it never moves. So, but it may jump. So this is the important part. So the consumer investor is going to be just a log utility consumer. Again, just because it's simpler. You can do the other one, just everything gets a little messier. The cost of not doing the other one is that I don't get to put a risk aversion coefficient in the second equation, which I would like to do, but here. Okay. Anyways, but the consumer is going to be very simple. Consumer is going to be log utility, so it's going to consume proportionally to its her wealth. Okay, so I is consumer I, T times T, S is in state S, rho is the marginal permissive consumer out of wealth, and this is wealth. Okay, yet to be determined in equilibrium and so on, but that's wealth. Now, the key first of the condition in that I want to make this model risk-centric is this one, okay, which is the risk condition of the agent. And the risk condition of the agent for the log utility case says that W omega is the fraction of the wealth of the agent invested in the risky asset. In equilibrium, that's all assets we're going to have, so it's going to be equal to 1 in the homogeneous representative agent case. But this is the first order condition of the agent, so it's not 1 yet. So this is the volatility of capital in equilibrium. Part of it will be exogenous, and part of it endogenous. Endogenous part will shut down for a while. But this is the volatility, therefore, of the portfolio, of the wealth of the individual. So this is the volatility that the consumer is willing to absorb. Okay? And it's going to be proportional to the Sharpe ratio of the market. And the Sharpe ratio has two things, which I want to disentangle. The first thing is this term here, which is the excess return of risky capital, expected excess return of risky capital, conditional on no transition to a different volatility state. Okay, so we're in a low volatility state. This is conditional on what do I expect to get out of risky capital over riskless capital, over safe assets. It will be zero net supply in the economy, but over safe assets. Conditional on not transiting to a high volatility state or even lower volatility state. Okay, that's one term, and the second term is this is expected capital gain or losses from transitions to one state or the other. Importantly, all this stuff is discounted by the discount factor of the individual agent, and here you have subjective probabilities, I, and this is the individual discount factor, and so on, and there will be the first set of first order conditions is a contingent securities. So these are contingent securities. They will trade when there is a heterogeneous belief. They will trade arrow the burst securities on transitions to high volatility, low volatility, and so on. All that will be implicit here. That's the first order condition. All that I want to say from this, I'm not going to play much, but I think an important trick for those of you that like models, important trick is that you replace that stuff in there, this expression here, and you see that there is no I on the right-hand side because lambda cancels the lambda and I only get prices in there. And that's going to be very important actually for the solution of the model, which can be quite nightmarish with all these Poissons and that, because once there's no I there, then everyone has the same risky portfolio. That's going to be true even when I have heterogeneous beliefs. And then we will have different arrow derivative securities things. They bet differently on different transitions, but they're going to have the same risky portfolio. And that makes everything a lot simpler. I mean, a lot of the diffusions that drop out of the system is precisely because of this condition here. So regardless of whether I have heterogeneous beliefs, in that sense, it's going to be always representative. And that's the sense that it's complicated of the model. So that's a trick that took us a while to figure out, but it was. Last thing is equilibrium conditions, and then I'm going to examples and so on. So equilibrium in the goods market, the only thing that is interesting here is that, of course, the output has to be equal to demand, but the key point here is that there is an eta, so potential output is A times KTS, but there is an eta there. That means there could be excess capacity. Eta is less than 1, at least for now. Later on, we're going to relax that, but it's less than 1, less or equal than 1. So if it's less than 1, then we have excess capacity in the economy. That means this demand is a constraint, okay, which is a standard Keynesian sort of situation. Now, monetary policy here, interest rate policy is extremely simple, okay? Interest rate policy is simply set eta equal to 1 whenever you can. So monetary policy is really this with complementary slackness, no? So if the interest rate, the risk-free interest rate is above 0, above the 0 lower bound, if it's above 0, then eta is equal to 1. Monetary policy will take care of that, which can do it by sort of giving you the right sharp ratio. If R is equal to 0, then we're going to have excess capacity, okay? Then we're going to be sort of in a liquidity trap. So this holds with complementary slackness. And of course, financial markets, the wealth of the individuals have to be equal to the wealth of the economy, which is the capital stock times the value of that. And contingent securities are in zero net supply, okay? Nothing deep there. Keep going. Let's keep that top. I just want to pause here because it's obvious that time will get me. So, so this is, I want to pause in this term. This is the return on capital conditional on not transiting to a different volatility state. So suppose you are in a state in which there is excess capacity. If there is a state in which there is excess capacity, then the interest rate cannot sort of equilibrate that market. And the question is then, what can we do to this rate to equilibrate the market? And sort of the main candidate is Q, no? Well, if the asset prices drop, then that gives you an excess return because, you know, then you can generate a unit of profit. This is sort of a dividend yield, if you will. No? Then you can generate a dividend yield, you pay a lower price, that gives you a higher price. And the problem is, as I said before, is that, well, not so fast, because when this guy drops, this guy may drop as well. You have a problem. Not only so, when this guy drops, that guy drops as well. That guy there is the growth of capital stock, the gross growth in the capital stock, expected growth in the capital stock, because investment will drop. So now this term here is actually the expected rate of growth of the economy, this term here. So the expected rate of growth of the economy also drops. So you expect output to drop because there is excess capacity, but you also expect the rate of growth of the economy to drop, which lowers the return on capital in itself. So you get these two forces that push against you. So if we were to stop here, we're done. I can tell you that if we solve this, you go down, and that's the first thing we did. We worked with this model, and the thing imploded. Okay? So I'm telling you about the kitchen, but that's the way it happened. It's not that we saw it all from the beginning. Now let me get into equilibrium. I can characterize it. And here I want to connect to something that Thomas said yesterday. So equilibrium in the goods market. One nice thing of this, which comes from the Brunner, Meyer, and Sannikov sort of technology, is that everything is linear in capital. So you can sort of drop everything, drop capital, and now I can forget about capital. And the whole diffusion process goes to the capital, and it affects the risk premium, but you don't see it anymore. Okay? If I show you the path of the growth economy, you would see sort of lots of noise, but that's in the background. It's just generating risk in the economy, but it's not messing up your equations, which is useful. Now, this is equilibrium in the goods market. What is this? This is consumption. Rho times Q times K is consumption, but consumption per unit of capital. This is investment per unit of capital. And, well, whatever that is, given any Q, then you know what is excess capacity in the economy. If Q is low, then you have more excess capacity. So that establishes a positive relationship between, this is the log of Q, but between Q and excess capacity. Okay? So if Q is low, excess capacity is higher, and so on and so forth. That's a problem. Now I want to, and this is the thing, the mechanism that creates so much instability. Okay, so now you can use the same complementary slackness of monetary policy to make the following claim, which is that if the risk-free interest rate is positive, then capital is always whatever you need. The price of capital is always whatever you need to have excess capacity at 0. Therefore, eta at 1. Okay, so there's a Q star here which solves for eta equal 1. That's economy in full employment. But if the interest rate is negative, then Q is going to be lower than Q star. And then we have to see what happens to the rest of the economy. Now, that's what I'll use. But I want to connect a little bit with what Thomas said yesterday. Because Thomas said yesterday something which is true, but the implications are not exactly, I think, what he had in mind, at least when you look at the world from the point of view of this model. And I'm going to get outside this model, but to tell you something I think is going on in the world at this moment. I think that he talked about essentially this guy coming down. One of the puzzles of the post-crisis era is that eta came down, that psi came down, or maybe there's a constant there or something, but you see a gap, which he interprets as imperfect competition and so on. I think it's a very sensible interpretation. I tell you that, as I told him afterwards, the same is going on here, actually. Consumption is also dropping as a function of wealth in the world. And I think that's very connected. There are many reasons, but one of the things is connected to the theme of this afternoon, is that income distribution has gotten a lot worse, there's lower marginal propensity to consume of the rich, and so on, and that has also sort of introduced a drag in the economy. But look at what happens in this model if I bring rho and psi down. Then the only way I keep full employment is by having a higher value of Q, a higher value of wealth. So when he said yesterday, look, he's not here, but I can then complain. When he said yesterday, look, people must be very optimistic because you need high value of, we see all these high valuations. Well, that's what you need now to support a basic equilibrium. You need much higher values. And I would argue that a lot of what central banks have been doing for quite some time is trying to boost asset values. They call it differently stuff. In Japan, they're very open about it. You know, they buy ETFs. They're trying to boost sort of the value of equity because you need a higher wealth to support the same old equilibrium when these two things are lower. And so I see all this very consistent as part of the same. Now, in this model, log utility and so on, these things are not affected by risk themselves. But if you enrich the model, you could affect things like this by risk in itself, and so on. I'm checking you. Okay, good. Anyways, that was the tour.
1 p.m.
Huh?
1 p.m. 17.
Well, I'm checking you literally with a chronometer, okay? So, anyways, it's good that the monitor gets monitored once in a while, no? In any event, but that was the tool. But I'm saying you could incorporate all that in here by just shifting those parameters, and then you need sort of higher wealth. And I think that's the world we live in. You need higher wealth to support the old aggregate demand, and that creates other problems, fragilities, and so on. But that's it. Anyway, so instability and hope. So instability I already have described is that you know. So the question is, what happens to expected return on capital condition no transition when we change Q? Well, it drops. Okay, it drops because the effect of aggregate demand. This I have substituted the equilibrium goods market into the old equation I explained. The effect of aggregate demand and Q on the dividend yields sort of gets offset each other exactly, so you get that constant there. But the point is that the dividend yield will not help you, and then the growth component here hurts you. So if Q drops, that's not, so Q drops, then you lose equilibrium in the goods market, and on top of that, it's not helping you in the financial market. It's getting worse. Okay, so you need hope, and the hope comes entirely from this term here, which is expected capital gain. Okay? This is already, I already solved out for prices, so that what matters once you take into account prices is the average of the subjective beliefs about the recovery. Because everything, you know, those I remember I showed you already that all that mattered there was the price, and the price is a function of the average subjective belief, in which the average is weighted by the wealth of the different individuals in the population. Okay, but anyways, but all that can save you here is that so what you need somehow to get equilibrium is that this thing is increasing in or decreasing in Q, increasing in Q. Okay. Did I say it right? Yes, you need this to be increasing in Q. Okay.
Just a stupid question. R is not...
I recognize the voice, but the tone, I recognize the introduction, I couldn't see you, but I knew who you were. Flashbacks, I mean, from 30 years ago.
Small r is the nominal rate?
By the way, no, I'm not going to tell you. Sorry.
Is small r the nominal interest rate?
No, real. Everything is real in the small.
So why is there a zero lower bound?
Doesn't matter. Were you here in my introduction?
Yes.
Okay. No, doesn't matter as long as you have well, several answers, but once you have a nominal rigidity and you have sort of sticky prices and so on, that translates into the real rate. That's one. Second, there are many other reasons why people don't like very low rates. I mean, people talk about the reversal rate, for example. It's at which point the rates start hurting your financial system and so on. So that's for that bound. I don't take the zero lower bound as something that's special. I mean, there are many places in the world that have already even broken that. But the question is, does it get rigid? I mean, this analysis will also apply to a central bank that is very ideological and decides not to lower rates.
I thought that if the nominal interest rate is zero, we need more inflation, which means that the real interest rate should be negative. So how can we dislike a negative real rate? How can anybody dislike a negative real rate if that is the equilibrium interest rate?
Done that way is disliked. It's liked, but we haven't found a way of doing it that way. Okay, that's so if you find that recipe, that's a great thing, but we haven't found it.
In your model, you say, look, the real interest rate cannot fall below zero. So, I mean, everything which is a disequilibrium in your model comes from this rigidity,
yes,
which is very different, I think, from zero lower bound as commonly understood.
It's not very different as commonly understood. Again, because
the whole point of the zero lower bound is that it prevents. Yeah, I see. It prevents the real rate from becoming negative if there is no inflation.
Yeah, but that's what happens. Unfortunately, that correlation goes the wrong way. I mean, Japan. You wish to have that. Japan used to have the highest real interest rates in the world, actually. People talk about the low interest rate in Japan. They had the highest when they really wanted to have the lowest. It's very difficult to get out of that. But I'm with you. If we do find a higher inflation equilibrium, that would solve a lot of these problems. And I understand that. I just don't know how to do it, but I understand that. Anyways, where was I? Okay, good. Anyways, and in the first best, you know, nothing of this will happen. There's no constraint, then the price will be constant here. Around that diffusion that is moving around the value of capital, no? And growth will be maximal and so on. Obviously, so now I have to decide what do I do. Anyways, that's the way the model works, and I have to tell you what else is in here that. Well, here you can see. Let me do this, and then I have 3 minutes.
We have 7 minutes.
Oh, good.
11 seconds.
Very good.
That's including questions.
Okay, good. So, anyways, two-state world. Just so you see it, very simple. So, the simplest possible model is representative agent. Two states, high vol, low vol, high vol. No, so in equilibrium, everyone has the same. That's always the case, but there's no contingent contracts or anything. no diffusion, no anything, nothing endogenous in there. That's the simplest possible model. And so that's the equilibrium condition. That's what I just showed you. So this is the expected return on the risky asset, condition of no transition, plus this term here, which is what gives you, if you, for example, if you are in the lowest state, in the low volatility state 1, then this is Q star, and this is whatever is the price in the high volatility state, and vice versa. So what is important then is that when you're in the high volatility state, then this guy is going to be lower than Q star, and this is Q star, so this is less than 1, and you have a positive term. That's what is going to save you here. But if lambda, that requires a technical condition, that lambda S has to be sufficiently high. There has to be sufficient optimism to offset this term here. Okay? Good. But that I already explained. So assumption, suppose that volatility is high enough. So this is the risk-free interest rate here, and all this tells you that in the high volatility state, the desired riskless rate is negative. You can do that. And in the high volatility state, in the low volatility state, the equilibrium interest rate, the first best interest rate is positive, and so there's no problem. So in this case, and this is the economy, and that's the main case we analyze, you get that in the low volatility state, the interest rate is positive, there's no excess capacity, prices are at the maximum, while in the high volatility state, is what I already said 10 times, the interest rate is against the lower bound, the prices are asset prices are depressed. Thomas caveat aside, because I can also shift the other parameters and change all that, and there is excess capacity. Okay, so that's a basic equilibrium in this economy. I'm not going to explain more than that. Again, I did in words. This is another way of dealing with the Xavier issue. I mean, that reflects my age, is that whenever I write a model, I have to, at some point, write some diagram that looks like a ESLM somewhere. and if I can do it, I have hope on the thing. And we can do it here. There's an additional constraint, which is interesting, which is a risk constraint, which is what causes all the additional confusion. But you see this look very ISLM-like, but with asset prices and so on. In fact, this looks a little like Del Fleming, 4 diagrams. That really reflects my age. But this model can do it, and this is more to pacify myself. Al doesn't understand what I'm talking about when I show this, but that's fine. So let me just tell you in 3 minutes what happens when we add belief disagreement and the speculation. Well, obviously, now people begin to speculate in these contingent instruments, and the economy becomes extrapolative in the sense I said before. If the optimists are very optimistic during the boom, then they're going to tend to sell put options like crazy to the other guys. If there's no transition to the bad state, then they're going to become richer and richer, and so they're going to become wealthier and wealthier. If the transition happens, they're going to lose their shirt. Okay, so this is, you think of regulation, that's the problem, and so that's, and in the recession it's the other way around. The optimists start selling call options. If the recovery doesn't happen, then they lose their shirt selling derivatives there. I said the anticipation. What is interesting is here is obviously you want to, the more optimists you have, the better is the recession that you have, but you would prefer for any given level of wealth of the optimists, you would prefer them to have homogeneous belief rather than heterogeneous beliefs. This is what you get. That's the level of prices you get with heterogeneous belief. That's the level of prices you get with homogeneous belief. And the reason for these two things is the dynamics of speculation, sort of depress aggregate demand. Because we will anticipate that if the thing stays, if the recession lasts, you're going to be losing optimists along the way. I don't have time for that. Then there is a whole thing on welfare. The point of this section is to show that there is value for everyone of increasing, of making the optimists a little bit less optimist, which means essentially restricting their ability to trade both you first restrict their ability to sell puts in the boom, but if you do that, what they'll do is by proxy hedging, they will express their optimism by leveraging on the risky capital stuff. So you also have to limit their other portfolios. So you limit the 2 portfolios, that implements that, And what this picture shows you, there's no way you understand what is going on here, but what it shows you is that everyone is better off by that, locally. Now, if you do a lot of it, at some point, and this is for given Pareto weights. I'm showing the welfare gains for the normalized welfare, meaning normalized by the units of capital that each unit has. Okay, so it's the value of a unit of capital. So, and I'm saying what is that each agent gives to that as I change the share of wealth that is held by the optimist, but I'm not counting that changing share of wealth in the value in the welfare of each of them, because it's pretty obvious. If I make somebody rich, it's going to be better off. So in any event, so the point is that both like it, but they don't like it that much. So if you want to look for the optimal policy, the maximum they'll do is, yeah, I'm finishing. The maximum they'll do is not a lot, mostly because these guys value speculation. I mean, you know, the guys think that they have better information or whatever, they value speculation. That's the reason we do then something more robust, in which we do we analyze welfare under one's beliefs, persons, and we look across all the beliefs that you could have. So give weights, let the optimist decide, the pessimist decide, and then look for policies that are good under all those alternative beliefs. And then you get a lot of effect. You want to do a lot of regulation and so on, because the aggregate demand effect is pretty extensive. And I had to finish. This was to show that you want to do this stuff in the boom, not in the recession, for the reasons I explained before. I'm going to skip forward guidance, blah, 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 blah. This is to give some credit to Xavier, so I'm going to take from his time. His forward guidance really works well and is robust when people are optimists. It doesn't work that well otherwise. Endogenous volatility, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. Questions?
Just on macroprudential policy, you can see why the form of regulation to decrease optimism is good in good times, it is important. What did you say should not be done in bad times? I mean, macroprudential policy should be dynamic sometimes, so there should be some...
No. There is a space for it, but there's much less space. There it is. So this is how much you gain by doing it during the boom. This is how much you gain, and you can start losing quickly in the recession. And the reason is...
And what do you do in recession?
Huh?
And what do you do in recession? What is macroprudential policy?
It doesn't help you at all. Here.
What is the sense of...
Locally, yes. No, but... So macroprudential policy would be here, it's very abstract. It would be preventing the optimists from buying too many calls.
You would not want to do that in a recession, right?
Okay, yeah. If you do that, they're going to try to, if you don't let them do that, they're going to try to buy a lot of risky assets. And if you want to regulate that, that's costly because that depresses aggregate demand. That's the point. So here, that's what I said before, I told the Australians, is that there is a contractionary effect of macroprudential policy that you can offset very easily with movements in the interest rate during the boom, but you don't have that tool over there. So you have to live. It may be that you want to do it, and here you want to do a little, actually. You want to do it, but you don't want to do it as much because it has an aggregate demand effect, which is a first-order cost when you're in the middle of the recession. Now, you could argue, it's a more, you could argue that this creates optimism and you know, there's other things and so on, but those are other things. Lunchtime. Very good. Thank you.